Thank you very much. I was born in Germany in December 1931, and I was born in the city of Mainz, which is an old medieval city. That's where the printing press was invented and has been a center of much history of religion and government. And I was born there, and I was lucky to be born. I had a good life. And it started in Mainz. We spent a year in Mainz, my mother and father and I. And then my father bought an apartment house in Wiesbaden, where I lived the rest of the time that I was in Germany. My father was a businessman who was a representative for a big textile firm in Dresden, which is in eastern Germany. It's probably a few hundred miles from our home, and he was away from home quite a bit. So I spent a lot of time with my mother during those times, and with my grandparents. My grandfather, Sigmund, lived in a town called Finten, which is close to Mainz. It's now a suburb of Mainz. And he had served in the German cavalry in the early 1910, 120 in that time, and then retired to the family farm in Finten. My other grandparents lived in Groß-Gerau, which was probably about 30 miles away from where we lived. They had orchards with lots of fruit, and they grew the fruit so that they could make wines and liqueurs in a business that was called Edelweiss, which was, or Edelhirsch, I'm sorry. Their name was Hirsch, and had been in business probably for several hundred years. And this was a good family life for me. I visited with my grandparents. I spent time with my parents. I spent time on the farm. I learned how to milk cows by hand still, and had a lot of fun doing that. And this was really a good life, I felt. And the first sign to me that things were beginning to change was when I was about 4 to 5 years old. My father took me to see a movie, Der Gestiefelte Kater, which is Puss in Boots. And instead of showing cartoons or coming attractions, they showed, among other things, cartoons that depicted Jews as rats and horrible people. Here I was, a young Jewish boy, and this was the first time I realized that I was different, and it frightened me. Then, as things progressed, we couldn't associate with anyone who wasn't Jewish. My last name, Kahn, made others realize that we were Jewish. We didn't have to wear the stars or anything, because that came about much later. But we were still isolated, and the neighbors spied on us, and we could not talk with them because they were as frightened about it as we were, I think, looking back at it, because they were not allowed to associate with any Jewish people anymore. My father, who was dependent on driving back and forth and throughout the country, and probably some to Switzerland and to France, lost his driver's license. And he had been in the First World War when he was 18 years old in 1918, and was gassed in France and was brought back home to recuperate. He had some burns also. And he came home, and this was when Germany was losing the war. My grandfather, who knew what he was doing, said, "You're not going back." And he and my Uncle Max took my father in the barn and broke his leg. He never had to go back, which was lucky for all of us. Then, when I was old enough, I had to attend school, and I just could not go to a regular school. I had to go to a school for Jewish people. I was separate from others, and other boys who knew this was a Jewish school would wait for us, and they'd call us names, and they'd throw rocks at us. One day, I had enough. I had to ride my bicycle from our home. We were still in our apartment that my father owned. And I got to school, and there were a bunch of Hitler Youths there. And they decided they were going to take my bicycle from me and beat me up. But the bicycle had a removable seat on it. And I was so furious at this that I took the seat and I hit both of them over the head till they were bloody, and then put the seat back and ran away. I didn't go back to school for a while because my parents and my Uncle Max said, "You're not going there because if you were recognized and they knew who you were for sure, there might be a big problem." So my uncle was ready to take me to Switzerland to get me out of that situation. And luckily, it didn't happen. So we went on with that and felt the prejudice and all of the problems that happened. And my grandparents lost their homes. They lost the farm, they lost the business, and they had to move into Wiesbaden in the Jewish section. And the day of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, June 9th or June 10th, whichever was that whole night of 1938, there was a big pogrom against the Jews. I understood later the reason for this was that there was a Jewish man who assassinated a Nazi in France. He was there as a diplomat, and he was assassinated by this Jewish man, and this was in response to this assassination. And that night, everything happened. Synagogues were burned, businesses were destroyed, and they called it the night of the broken glass because they just broke into everything. And that night, the Gestapo came to our home. I recognized them because they were wearing the leather coats and the boots. And they took my father and my grandfathers away. Both my grandmothers were, in their time, they were they were ladies who just didn't take a back seat to anything. And one of my grandmothers argued with the Gestapo. And that didn't go too well. But she said some things that she probably shouldn't have said, but she did it anyway. So they took them away, and I did not see my father again for several months from the time of the Kristallnacht to the time that I saw him in April in Rotterdam. He went to Buchenwald. He was a prisoner at Buchenwald, and I later learned from a friend that I will tell you about a little later, that my grandmother had told my mother to go to Buchenwald and see the commandant and take my father's Iron Cross and his discharge papers from the German army and to release him. Unbelievable. But anyway, the commandant said, "Okay, we'll let him go. But Herman, if you're still in Germany 3 months from now, you're coming back to Buchenwald and you're never going to leave." So he spent a lot of time away from us. I didn't see him again, as I said, until we were in Holland. And he was busy trying to get the exit papers from the Nazis. And he had to find the money that I think that my grandfather Sigmund and he had squirreled away, either hidden somewhere or taken to Switzerland, because my grandfather still had a car in 1938, which was unbelievable because Jews were not allowed to buy any new cars. He bought a new car in 1938 and he felt he was a German. He was always a German, and he always would be a German. My father, in 1936, had gone to the United States and looked around. He spent a couple of months in the United States thinking things are not so good here in Germany. But then he said, it isn't going to happen. We're going to be okay. I'm going to go home. We're Germans. We've been Germans for hundreds of years, and that's where we belong. So he went back, and that's how he then got caught, and luckily he got out. We left Rotterdam and went to New York, and we went to Washington Heights. Now many of you probably have heard about Washington Heights, but this was Washington Heights in the late 1930s, and there were an awful lot of Jewish refugees that had moved to Washington Heights. In fact, one of my acquaintances wrote a book called Frankfurt on the Hudson. And a lot of these Germans were from the Rhineland, and they went to New York, to Washington Heights, which is at a higher altitude than downtown New York, and it kind of reminded them of the river of the Rhine, because the Hudson reminded them of the Rhine. So that's where I grew up after I was about 8 years old. I went to school and got through school with some problems. When I was 12 years old, I had rheumatic fever, and I couldn't go to school. I had to be in bed for 6 months, and then after I got out of bed, I had to go to a special class for slow learners, and finally got out, and I had problem getting back into school, but I made it. And I worked my way through to get into the Bronx High School of Science, which is the beginning of, for me, to be able to go then to college and to medical school, and I became a physician, and that's what happened. I went to Wisconsin, and I went to medical school in Salt Lake, and I took an internship in Philadelphia, and I went back and forth, and finally came to Denver, where I met my wife, who incidentally also has a background it's quite similar to mine. For some reason, we happened to meet each other, and it worked out. For I think it's 58 years. She's in the audience, so if I'm wrong, she'll let me know later. So after we were in Greeley, I worked in Denver for a while, and I came to Greeley and practiced here for about 35 years. And busy here at the hospital, but we decided to go back to Germany. And the first time we went back to Germany, it was a difficult time because I met people who asked me, "How come you speak German so well?" And I was afraid to say to them, well, I am German, I had to leave here, I didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings, which is kind of ridiculous anyway. But I had some other experiences where I retreated from the idea of this, and because I felt that some of these people had been our enemies. And so I didn't admit to that. I was afraid at times, because we had one experience where we went to the Black Forest, and the people at the hotel wanted my passport, and I said, "What's it for?" And they said, "For die Polizei," for the police. And the first thing I thought about, see, they're still looking for me. But they weren't, and we had a nice trip. And then many years later, I heard from a fellow on the internet that he was looking for survivors of the area, and he was a retired history professor. And so we corresponded by email, and finally I decided to go back to Germany to meet him. And the pictures that you're looking at now, we see there's my sister there, and Monica, my wife, and Siggy, who was the fellow that I met, the retired history professor. And we're outside the new synagogue. This is the new synagogue. And the new synagogue, as many of them that are built in Germany and have been built in Germany, were built by the help of the German government, and they are made of steel. The idea you're never going to burn me down again. And so they're wonderful places, and I did have an experience here. I went there on Saturday morning service, and all the people were speaking Russian, and I didn't speak any Russian. They didn't speak any German or English. Finally, a guy from Poland came by. He said, I know how to speak German, and so he told the rabbi that I was here and that who I was, and the rabbi called me up to the Torah for an aliyah, which was very nice, and we had a very nice time there. But we continued on, and he took us to my father's house where I lived as a young boy, and this is the front of the house, and the next picture will show the side of the house. It was a very nice apartment house. This, of course, was confiscated, and I don't think my father ever got very much out of it. There was some what they call Wiedergutmachungsgeld, money for, we want to pay you off somehow. And so they got a special Social Security amount of money for people who had their property stolen, but it really wasn't very much. So I wanted to see my old town. I wanted to see where my grandparents lived. And so this was still this was in Mainz, going towards the synagogue. And this was in my grandfather Sigmund's home in the backyard. And this shows where the farm had been, and this was all turned into condominiums. And he never got anything out of that. My grandfather Sigmund and my grandmother Paula went to the United States from Portugal. They spent the first few years of the war in Portugal, having escaped there. And my grandmother went to Ellis Island, and we never had to go to Ellis Island, but she did. She had a cough, and they thought she had tuberculosis, but she didn't. She had heart failure. And that's what her cough was due to, heart failure. So we spent many Sundays taking the ferry from New York over to Ellis Island, which was interesting. Monica and I went back many years later when it was made a museum, and it was nice to see that again. So then he took me to my grandmother's grave. My grandmother was my father's birth mother, who died in 1902. He took us to this small town, and this was a Jewish portion of the cemetery. I was under the mistaken opinion that the Nazis had destroyed all Jewish cemeteries. I had pictures, and I have a book of my mother's hometown, Gross-Gerau, where the Jewish people were forced to dig up the graves of the Jewish people that were in the wrong section of the cemetery and put them away somewhere else. I never found out exactly where. Now we're looking at a picture. Siggy was very instrumental in putting these golden plaques outside of homes for people who had either perished in concentration camp or were lost one way or another, and their homes were stolen. So they have these golden plaques, and this is very nice that they have done that. The fact that the Germans had done all of this, and that they were people who were understanding of the terrible things that had happened. But these kind of things take generations to recuperate from, and this is what is happening now. When we were in my mother's my father's hometown, we ran into a gentleman who was a baker, who was the son of the baker that my grandparents knew. And he heard that I was in town, and he said, "Robert's in town? Bring him over right away." So we went over there to visit with him, and he said, "I was 6 years old when I wasn't allowed to play with you anymore." But he said, "You see that rug on the wall? That's your grandmother's rug that we played on, and I got it from an Israeli who took it from a Nazi." This picture, I'm going to sort of try to end up on. This was something that my niece, who lives in Denver, is maybe in the audience. I hope she made it in time. Yes, you are. Okay. Jody went to Israel on a trip, and she was at Yad Vashem, which is the museum for the concentration camp situations. And she met a lady there, and they talked for a while, and they became sort of friendly, and then they said goodbye. And I believe the week after that, they met again in downtown Jerusalem. And they had lunch together. And the lady said, you know, my grandparents live in Israel, and they came from Poland, and when they had to go through Germany to get a ship to go out, they were being chased by Nazis, and a family took them in to hide them and pulled out a picture of my mother and my sister. And it was my mother that hid those people. And this is, you know, when we talk today about women coming to realize that they have to come into their own, and they are coming into their own. And these are stories about strong women. My mother got my father out of the concentration camp. My mother took this horrible chance of taking these people in. So, to wrap it up, I want to tell you that the reason I'm doing this is because, as we say in the Holocaust Memorial times, never again. And we don't ever want to see it again. And it's very important. Martin Niemöller is a pastor, Protestant pastor. And these are his famous sayings. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Thank you very much.